on Plato's Dialogs concerning the Trial of Socrates.
This is Jack Donovan. You're listening to or watching PH2T3R, Pater, the Journal of Solar Culture. And I'm here with C.B. Robertson, as always. And today we're going to discuss some of Plato's dialogues about the Trial of Socrates. And when I asked Chris about, I'm heading to Athens in a week or so, and I asked, we should read Greek stuff this month. What should we read that's philosophical, that's the whole group can read? And Whole Order of Fire actually read some of these dialogues, and it really stood out to me. I just okay, cool, we'll read those. And I didn't expect them to feel as timely as they do. And so many of the issues that we're dealing, that's the cliche of reading the classics. Like, it's always true, and it's always, you'll see that you compare it to your own life. I feel like I'm in junior high school. But it really is true in this particular case, especially with we see, all these show trials that are happening right now. And the trial of Socrates is definitely, you could call it a kangaroo court kind of trial. The charges are very strange and making the impiety and making the good thing seem less than the
lesser appear to be the greater.
Yeah. Very, very that's kind of a made up charge. It's kind of, but so you see that, and you also see it was very striking to see the level of persecution that was happening there, because when we talk about, I think especially this golden age of philosophy in Athens, I think it has this gilded image in the Western mind, whereas they had it all figured out. We'll build all of our democracies based on their democracy, which is a democracy that was just men of a certain class and who also executed people they didn't like for saying the wrong thing. So it feels very contemporary in a lot of ways. And so that was really, that really struck me. So, and they're short dialogues and they're very digestible, and there's a lot in each one. So I'm going to start. We have a lot to unpack with all these because we've been talking about these for a couple weeks, and I know Chris has a lot to say and I have a lot to say. But I'm going to start with Euthyphro. And first, when you listen to it on Audible, don't listen to the audio samples, because there's one with an English guy who has the English equivalent of a Boston accent. He's like, Euthyphro was the whole time. I can't see the word now without hearing Euthyphro. But Euthyphro,
there's one guy on YouTube who he has that baritone African American voice that's just perfect.
Nice.
He does. I think Euthyphro, the Apology, and Crito. He doesn't do Phaedo, unfortunately. But,
okay.
I'll find that one.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be a lot better than this one. I actually, because I hated it so much, I downloaded a different version from Audible today to listen to on the elliptical while I was getting ready to do this podcast, and it was much better. But the basic premise of Euthyphro, obviously, there's a lot to it. But the basic idea is that Socrates runs into this guy who's going to court, and he is going to court to bring his father up on charges for murder. And so they have a discussion about this, and it includes several concepts that I think are relevant. And then we'll get to obviously the trial of Socrates himself, but it's kind of a nice lead in to that, because they're talking about impiety, and Socrates is saying, hey, if you know so much about piety and this is what the gods want, maybe I should be your student, and then I can get off of these charges because you'll be, or maybe they'll prosecute you instead because you told me what to do. Which is, obviously Socrates is a little bit of a troll, and we'll get to that later. But it was interesting in the sense of I think Euthyphro's idea of justice. Now, piety is a different subject, but his idea of what was just actually would feel very familiar to an average American. It would feel less, to a more patriarchal society. Bring your father up on charges, I think, is a little bit more intense. But that is equality under the law. Like everyone has the same law no matter what. And I think that most Americans actually would feel pretty comfortable with that. Like, oh, your dad killed somebody, dude. You know, like, and now it was a slave. So, you know, again, a different kind of society altogether. But the idea, obviously, and Socrates even seems taken aback, like, really, you're prosecuting your dad just because you think it's right?
Yeah.
And, you know, yeah, like I said, it does sound, to be honest, I feel like the Euthyphro has the better argument, except for he messes it up in terms, he convolutes it with what the gods want.
Well, I mean, that sort of becomes the subject, because, you know, the defining feature of Socrates's wisdom, if we can call it that, is that he doesn't know. Yeah. It's that epistemic humility, and what we have in Euthyphro is an extremely legally and morally complicated situation. It's like, this is, you know, there are plausible arguments for either side, and you could make a strong case in either way. It's kind of hard to gauge, and yet Euthyphro seems extremely confident, certain even of his own knowledge of the good. And it almost feels as if Socrates is not pressing him on the righteousness of his action, but on his certainty specifically. Like, how can you know that you're on the side of the gods? And then it becomes a question about, what is piety even? Is it what the gods love, or, you know, do the gods love it because it is good? And I mean, we're in the Solar Idealism worldview in a very fortunate position, because we get to say, well, those are identical. The gods are idealized conceptions of ourselves in many ways. They're ideals that essentially are the good definitionally, and unlike with Christianity, that's not tied to existing physically, which is nice.
Right. Well, I mean, it's they're really manifestations of our idea of what's good.
Right.
So it's already, it's a self-answering question to a certain extent. Like, well, that is what I think is good, because that's what the God represents. Right. So that's we don't have to wonder what the God is thinking, because that's the joke I always make about these religions. I think so many people like to, I guess I've said before, put God in their pocket, and they want to say a thing, but they want to have God say it for them. Right. So they have backup.
Which is what my 3-year-old does with his toys. He'll say, no, I don't want the snack. The T-Rex wants the snack. And we're like, oh, okay. It gets more complicated as you get older. It gets more advanced, but the form is kind of similar. So,
or maybe not more complicated.
Or not more complicated. As the case may be.
God says that you want just hold up a little thing of Jesus and be like, Jesus says that you want to do it. And like,
right.
That would make a really funny parody, actually. That would be really, if I was a funny person. We were just talking how I actually am a funny person, but I don't do that as a public image thing. I don't like to do comedy. But man, that would be hilarious. TikTok videos is like someone holding up a little Jesus thing and be like, Jesus says that you're not allowed.
I'm sure they've done that. Someone has had to have done stuff like that. But I mean, but and it's a way to get out of making, saying this is my opinion, this is my position. It's like, no, I'm just following orders, as they might say in certain contexts too, because God doesn't have to be supernatural. It can be civic, perhaps.
Well, I'd say a little bit too, like the discussion you were having the other day about being imprecise with your words intentionally to so that you aren't culpable for exactly what you said. Like you can leave it open-ended, which is, I mean, really what you do when you write a scientific paper too. I mean, not a scientific, I mean, that's probably the wrong word, but an academic paper.
Good enough at that, you can become a lawyer and make money doing that.
Yeah. I mean, well, I mean, if you,
which is the predicament Socrates was in.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of what you do. It's bad writing in terms of, if you're going to make really something impactful, which I still remember when that word everybody started using impactful, but no one used it before a certain point. And then it started saying, now I say it. But if you really want writing that's going to stand the test of time, you just say what you're going to say. But if you want to not get taken down for it, you use all these qualifying and weasel words and all kinds of stuff like that. And that's a lot of academic writing is like it, because they don't want to make a firm statement unless you're making a firm statement. Right. So you like, this could also be this way, and this could also be this way, and you just kind of like weasel it out. But which you kind of have to do in some scenarios. You only want to commit to what you want to commit to. But it's anyway. Kind of a sidebar discussion, but
yeah. Well, and that's also relevant to Socrates because, I mean, part of the subject of, I know we're jumping from Euthyphro perhaps to apology. I hope that's okay. But, we don't get to hear the prosecution side, but we hear from Socrates describing the prosecution that they are very skillful rhetoricians, and they accuse him also of being a skillful rhetorician, interestingly enough. And his opening argument is basically saying it is absurd that they would call me a skillful rhetorician when they speak in this very skillful lawyerly manner. I will, you'll have to forgive me because I'm going to speak in the only way I know how, which is how I speak in front of the banking tables in the marketplace. And he describes it literally with the word ateknos, which means without skill, unskillfully. But it's a sort of pejorative of the people who speak with skill, with artifice,
right?
With flowery embellishment. It's like saying, it would be like saying, you speak like a lawyer today. There's a subtle insult in saying, I'm going to speak directly. Right. And at one point later on in the dialogue, he says, most translations will say, it is my duty to speak the truth, and it is the honor of the judge to determine the truth. But the two words for truth are different. He says, it is my duty to speak dike, which means directly, to speak with justice, we might say. Directness and with justice are kind of interchangeable in the very old Greek. And it is the honor of the judge to determine aletheia, what is uncovered, what is true. So there's this equation of directness with justice, with moral righteousness, that Socrates really embraces, and he's very good at it, but that's not good in the context of the law. It's more important to have this skill, which again, as you pointed out, in scientific journals and in academia, you're going to do a lot better if you write or speak with artifice, with technos as opposed to ateknos. Even though it doesn't last as long. Socrates has been with us for 2,400 years now. It's a pretty good
I mean, that's why. I mean, there's someone who said, I think it's a terrible person actually, but someone said once that a writer should really be able to hang himself. And like good writing, a writer really is like put himself out there, and I think that is a little bit true.
Scott Adams said something similar just a few weeks ago. He said the thing that makes good comedy funny is the sense the audience gets that the comedian is in danger, is in getting himself into trouble. And you hear this especially with someone like Bill Burr, who's very good at walking right on the line of saying something very offensive that will get him canceled. And every once in a while, a comedian will go one step too far and actually get canceled. But the thing that is humorous and amusing and eye-catching, perhaps, is the people who bring themselves right up to that line.
Well, what's funny about comedians, and then we'll get back to this because we could go that route before. Yeah. But what's funny about comedians is that, Weirdly, Anton LaVey always said that comedians aren't really funny, which I always liked and appreciate because I've never like really been a comedy watcher, guy. Because I mean, 90% of those times they'll say things because they are closer to being in danger because they're on stage. Your friend will say something funnier than that to you, or way over the line of that, because you're really speaking directly. Like you're really speaking fairly, and you don't have to worry about all that other stuff. So I think, a lot of times friends have like darker or more like, like funny takes because things that are funny because they're true.
Yeah.
But you don't say them in a room to like 200 people, so like they're a little funnier sometimes.
Well, there's so much in comedy that is that, and I think this applies to rhetoric more broadly and not just comedy, which maybe ties back to our dialogues here, but that like it works because the audience has accepted certain premises.
Mm-hmm.
But like if you hear, for example, someone who doesn't share your politics trying to make jokes that are in the political domain, you're like I'm not even offended. It's just not funny because the premise just like doesn't work. And I mean, studying philosophy kind of does that to a lot of comedy too. I have a hard time watching comedy because it's like, I get that about like everything.
Yeah, I mean, I know exactly what you're saying, and I was thinking it as you started to say it. Like it's like watching Saturday Night Live now. It's like unwatchable because like that's what they're saying is like, can you believe they don't believe the things that we believe?
That's
much. Literally all it is. And for the same thing, I mean, I feel like they probably feel the same way about the Babylon Bee.
Very probably, yeah. Well, it's just it's the same thing in reverse, and
exactly,
and like I know you. This would be a funny mirror because you just brought up Anton LaVey. C.S. Lewis, in one of his books, I believe it's Screwtape Letters, brings up there are 4 kinds of laughter that you can generate. One is from joy, which is like the best kind, or the worst kind because it's written from demons' perspective. There, it's like that's bad, which means it's good. Then there's the there was I can't remember the second one. The third one was the joke proper, which actually takes skill to do. And like that can be amusing, but it's also kind of corrosive in some ways. But the fourth one, which is the worst or the best if you're a demon, was just a flippancy. And that's you speak as if a joke has been made, but you haven't actually pointed out an absurdity. You haven't actually observed anything intelligent. You've just spoken as if something is ridiculous, but without doing the work. And it feels like so much of humor today within these tribes is just flippancy. There's no actual intelligence to it at all if you listen to like Stephen Colbert or some of these people. But even outside of comedy, that's how a lot of discourse in general goes, where people have conversations like, can you believe X? And there's no deeper analysis of what X is. They just accept the words at face value in the way that certain comedians will accept the premises at face value because their audience does too. And, at a metaphorical level, Socrates was probably jarring to a lot of people because, they accept these premises and certain jokes are funny. And he's like, not seeing what's funny about it, or says, oh, I can see why that's funny, but would it still be funny if we truly analyze this this premise here? And suddenly everyone's like, oh.
So you're saying he's not really fun at parties.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends on your nature, I suppose. They depict him in the Symposium as quite the life of the party, but maybe Plato was mischaracterizing that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, to wrap up, I thought about Euthyphro. One more thing, that if I were Socrates, what I would have said to this kid who's prosecuting his dad is like, why are you mad at your dad? What's your relationship with your father like? I think that's because it's just a strange. It's not that his father shouldn't be prosecuted, but the fact that his son is prosecuting him leads me to believe that there's trouble at home.
It's such an archetypal dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah. There's trouble at home. Like you're mad at your dad for something else because that sure, that's wrong and whatever. But I would feel like that would be my first question. like in that thing, like not taking it at face value as to like, oh, your stated intentions are your actual intentions are generally not. That's not usually true with most people. They're doing things for other reasons than they state outright to begin with. Not always. I like to think that I mostly am truthful in what I say, and I'm doing it because I'm saying what I'm doing. But and also a lot of people, to be fair, don't understand their own motivations.
Yeah. What was that?
People are very self-aware.
What was that line from Nietzsche? What was silence in the Father, speaks in the Son? And I've often seen the unspoken secrets of the Father emerge in the Sons. Something. It was from the Tarantulas line section. I'll have to go back over that again. But that's, I think, probably a very incisive thought to have in that dynamic.
Yeah. It's always
especially when he has that certainty in such a complex legal and moral situation.
Yeah, I mean, or if I was a cop, if I was a cop, I'd be like, or a lawyer or whatever, like. So if your father goes to prison or gets executed, are you first in line for his estate? Like I feel like these questions are like at the top of the list.
Cui bono.
Yeah, exactly. Like this, that's what I want to know. That's interesting.
Yeah.
But because he clearly had slaves and he obviously has some wealth, and so yeah.
Which is interestingly also one of Socrates' defenses when he's accused of corrupting the youth. And he says, if I were to corrupt the youth and I have to live alongside them, how would I benefit from that?
Right.
Which seem not to persuade the audience. But again, it's hard to speak if you don't share the premises.
Well, let's get into the apology a little bit more. Trying to think what I should reach for in it, but we should move on to that one because we did our Euthyphro and we should go on to apology. The trial itself and what he's accused of. You brought a point about his accuser that I thought was interesting early on because you were like, I think his accuser is from 4chan.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, at one point, Socrates, I wish I brought up the exact quote, but he in two different sections, he basically says, and it's related to this fleshing out what would it look like for me to corrupt the youth in the city that I live in. He basically tries to demonstrate that the accuser is not serious, is having fun, and basically saying, "Oh, Socrates is a skillful rhetorician. Let me see if I can get one over on him and trap him in his words, kind of as a joke." And this is Socrates' allegation of the accuser, Miletus, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, Miletus. And as I was listening to it again today, he was described as having. They actually described him physically in Euthyphro because he brings him up early. I was just flipping through it trying to find it. He had like long straight hair and kind of a. I don't want to over. Right, but kind of a distinctive nose.
Oh, an aquiline nose. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Like, so he had those are the cool ones, really. They're the ones that look cool in statues. I believe the aquiline is the one that has the like kind of comes out then goes down.
So I found the two quotes. And granted, for everyone, these are Socrates' words. So, in his defense, we don't hear the other side, but he says, quote, "He says that I am a doer of evil who corrupt the youth. But I say, O men of Athens, that Miletus is a doer of evil. And the evil is that he makes a joke of a serious matter and is too ready at bringing other men to trial from a pretended zeal and interest about matters in which he really never had the smallest interest." And then he continues later. He says, "You are a liar, Miletus, not believed even by yourself. For I cannot help thinking, O men of Athens, that Miletus is a reckless and impudent, and that he has written this indictment in a spirit of mere wantonness and youthful bravado. Has he not compounded a riddle, thinking to try me? He said to himself, I shall see whether this wise Socrates will discover my ingenious contradiction, or whether I shall be able to deceive him and the rest of them. For he certainly does not appear to me to contradict himself in the indictment, as much as if he said that Socrates is guilty of not believing in the gods and yet of believing in them. But this is surely a piece of fun. End quote. So it's hard to tell if this is a rhetorical maneuver by Socrates, because he sometimes does things like this, at least in the other Platonic dialogues, which are not Socrates, but or if he really is accurately trying to psychoanalyze this guy who's saying, you're accusing me of mutually exclusive things. Is this a joke? Because, I mean, the reason Socrates is the way he is that he's essentially on a mission from Apollo to find a man wiser than himself. So being accused of not believing in the gods, and he's like, are you accusing me of not believing in the right gods or of not believing in gods at all and being an atheist? And Meletus says, you're an atheist. And Socrates is like, my raison d'etre for the last 35 years or whatever has been a holy religious mission. And, corrupting the minds of the youth, he says, like, of course, how would I benefit from doing that? And who spends all this time with the youth? And he does this amusing sequence of questions of like, who benefits the youth? And Meletus's answer is ultimately, well, basically everyone except you. And Socrates is like, well, interesting. Okay. Especially the judges, Meletus says in the court. It's like, could not get more like ass kissing than that. Like almost in your face ass kissing. And Socrates just like rips that apart, or at least seems to.
Do you think that and you've read more about this than I have. Obviously, I've read through these and some background material. But I mean, do you think that Socrates is sincere in his dedication to Apollo? Or do you think that he's dedicated, or he's using that as a smokescreen to be like, clearly, I'm set, because I mean, his argumentation seems a little atheistic in most cases. It doesn't seem to, like in Euthyphro, for instance. I mean, he's arguing like the gods are do terrible things, and they do terrible things to each other, and right. What do they even believe, and what are they even about? Is a lot of the question, and so like I wonder if that's his out, because if you're say you're in medieval England, medieval like Renaissance like Italy, there's only so far that you go. You don't say God isn't real, but you do say, but God sent me to send you. Like the way you frame that is a little different.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because that argument actually has been made by other people too, about other people. Maybe the most notorious instance in Western civilization is Augustine in City of God making this argument against the Roman pagans by saying, look at how ridiculously your own depictions of your gods are. He's basically making that challenge. But Augustine was a Platonist, and Augustine was borrowing perhaps from the Republic, where Plato makes similar arguments, and he puts them into the mouth of Socrates and says, these gods, the way these are depicted, could not possibly be real gods. So like the voice of Socrates winds up on both sides of this question. Mm-hmm. Now, that depiction goes all the way back to Homer, because Plato's Socrates' criticism of the depiction of the gods in this way is a criticism of Homer and an argument that Homer ought to be censored. And if the majority of Greece at the time embraced Homer, which we have every reason to believe that they did, he was like widely loved even in his own time, let alone several hundred years later. That depiction of the gods as sometimes unlikable. Ares was not a good god in many ways. Aphrodite had her shortcomings, we can say, as did Hera and Zeus, for that matter. If Socrates believed in Apollo, it was, if not in a way similar to many other Greeks in his time, which is not to say in a Christian way exactly, but it would have been very familiar to the way that Nietzsche describes the Apollonian spirit. Mm-hmm. That like the pursuit of that way of living. And I mean, the way that they praise, I'm jumping dialogues a little bit to make the point, but the way that they praise Eros in the Symposium is by giving philosophical explanations of what love is. And so the praise looks different. The God looks different. It's much more conceptualized. And I mean, that seems to be very common, not just in Greece, but in other kind of polytheistic pagan societies more broadly. But when he talks about the gods of the city, it might be going back to that whole comedy question of like, does he not accept the same premises we do? Does he have the gall to explore if democracy is good rather than accepting it as axiomatically good? Because if Socrates is not being sincere, it is equally true, I think, that the prosecution is not being sincere. He's accused of impiety, he's accused of corrupting the minds of the youth, but the real reason that they're prosecuting him is political. There was the Athenians lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. Sparta installed a puppet state, which was called the 30 Tyrants, which lasted for a short period of time before they were kicked out. And that was not a good time for Athenians. It was like 18 months, I want to say, of attempting to impose like a Spartan ideals on Athenians who like their freedom and like their citizenship. And another writer I heard recently said that Critias, who was one of the 30 tyrants and one of Socrates' students, really was what sort of, we'll say, NPC progressives think Hitler was. Like what their worst caricature of Hitler, Critias actually was that. Right. In terms of how awful he was. So that connection to Socrates probably had a lot more to do with why they were going after him.
Yeah. I mean, it's never quite the reason, like,
right.
I mean, not to people always say we're going to talk about Trump when there's like a million show trials going on right now. But the first thing that pops in my head was like, no one actually cares how much Mar-a-Lago was valued at. Like, right. Like that has nothing to do with anything for anyone.
We can create a fraud case out of a judge acting like a realtor. Okay.
Yeah. Absolute ridiculousness. Yeah. But yeah, it's never about the thing when it comes to a public figure like that. So it's just what can we get them on? And that seems like the case, corrupting the youth.
Well, and that dovetails a little bit into, and I don't want to get into the Republic. There's a lot to say there, but that's a huge other topic on its own.
Much bigger project.
But at one point towards the end of the Apology, Socrates does say, I always aspired for the private life. Do you not think I would know how short of a lifetime I would have if I tried to be a public person? And in some of the dialogues he is recorded as having later by Plato, he seems to be trying to encourage other young men to pursue the private life and not the public life, not the political life, contrary to what a lot of modern Platonists believe. He seemed to view the private life not just as a personal calling but as almost morally superior to the public life in many ways. And I think if there is any relevance to the exploration of what is justice and what are these things, there is a question to be had, like, what is it that the people who are getting involved in these protests and winding up in show trials, perhaps like Socrates, what is it that they were trying to preserve? Was it justice as the objective rule of law that preserves civilization? Or is it justice as a virtue? Or is it what justice really was historically, which was just vengeance? Mm-hmm. And I think what we're beginning to see is that the confusion of those three things gets people into a lot of trouble very quickly. And you can end up defending things that you didn't realize you were defending, and getting caught up in battles that you didn't realize you were getting caught up in. And people think that they're defending this objective rule of law that perhaps was an illusion this whole time. And the real options they had were between virtue and vengeance. It's a real possibility that seems to be brought up in both these dialogues and other dialogues. I feel like Crito in particular hits the point home very hard, as far as like the virtue and marrying the political with the personal in terms of patriotism and submitting to the rule of law, which was a very interesting, but also a sort of a leading line of thinking as well.
Yeah, I remember having discussions with some of the guys in the Order of Fire about that, and it came down to the patriotism angle. It seemed very unconvincing, in terms of like I don't know if that. I guess the point I wanted to bring up, and I brought it up a little bit in the newsletter the other day, but I think it's a good. Oh yeah, that's what I was going to make that Instagram post about. I was like, I knew I had something, but because I think it's a good thing to think about is your story. And I think that really one of the subtexts, I think, when Socrates is defending why he's not going to escape and run around, to different places, to different cities and so forth, I think one of the big things that's almost implied there in a little bit of his language is that, he's thinking about his story. Like, what is the story of this man? And the story of this man, like this old man running from place to place, because he's been accused, because he's basically a convicted murderer. And he's not convicted murderer, but he's basically a convict that's been
convicted of impiety
to death.
Yeah,
convicted of bullshit. But so he's gonna go from of kind of a treasony kind of thing. So he's gonna be running around
insurrection almost.
We just went down the outro. But I mean, if he obviously to stirring people up, in a way, and but the story of him would be, like there's a 70-year-old man who's going to go from place to place under cover of darkness, and evade the authorities while his kids still live in Athens and are educated in Athens and whatever, because that kind of what's discussed is that I'm not going to pull my kids out of school or whatever you would call it. I'm not going to move my kids around with me. And I think that's I still think it's the weirdest thing about Socrates that you just don't hear about is the fact that he's 70 years old and he has 2 young children. And that's all. I don't hear of him. Did he have more children, or is just he's 70, he just all of a sudden has 2 young children? How'd that go down? What's that life story about?
If it's any insight into his situation, Socrates has this famous line where he's asked by a young man if he should marry, and Socrates says, "By all means, marry. If you get a good wife, you'll have a happy life. And if you get a bad wife, you'll become a philosopher." So, maybe not an insight into philosophy, but maybe an insight into Socrates.
Perhaps. which is funny. Maybe that's why. That's exactly interesting. Something just came full circle for me. There's a guy from the Manosphere who I like very much. He's an architect who goes by the name of Socrates and has for many years. And so I wonder if that's one of the reasons that he's a very smart guy, obviously, as well. But I wonder if that specific quote is one of the reasons why, he ended up eventually he did get married like several years ago, and he has a daughter, and he's very pro that now. But I mean, maybe he probably wasn't when he started, because he's an older guy, and he very similar. I mean, he's probably pushing 60. And he has a young daughter, and so interesting. Sorry, that just came together for me because I've hung out at his house a few times. Well, fantastic dude.
Well, and sort of related to that, I guess, or maybe not, but it triggered the thought in my head. You started by saying it's interesting to see how like repetitious this seems. It's like, oh, we're seeing the same thing today that was happening 24 years ago.
Yes.
It can be very hard to know the difference between what was captured 2,400 years ago that is transcendently true about humans and about existence, and that we're just seeing the repeat, or was some kind of precedent set by the thing that we're writing, and we're seeing a repetition of something that was set out 2,400 years ago, not something that existed prior to it, but we're seeing basically, well, to borrow from another podcast theme, sorcery at work in the creation of the world that we live in, and we're just now reading through the source code, as it were, rather than some kind of observer's description.
Possibly. I tend to generally go with there are certain obviously ideas that come into the world and become viral in a certain way. When it comes to things like human nature, like that, though, the quote about like if you have a good wife, you'll be happy. If you have a bad wife, you become a philosopher. That sounds deeply human.
That's maybe more transcendental.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to compare philosophical traditions. Alfred Whitehead, I think I might be getting that name wrong, famously said that the history of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. Mm-hmm. And what he meant was that Plato basically set the tone and established the subjects of philosophical inquiry in the West. And that Western part is significant because you don't see it necessarily in the same way in, for example, Chinese philosophy and in other civilizations. Like the way the Greeks conceptualized the immortality of the soul, for example, was like very, very unique to the Greek view. Other civilizations had notions of immortality. There's like reincarnation in India, and then other things like that. Ancestor.
Yeah, we talked about the Sumerians before because their weird thing where they're sitting in bird costumes forever. Yeah,
and like the Egyptians had their own thing, but the Greek notion of this like heroic immortalization is very unique, and it dovetails into philosophy, is in some way married to philosophy by Socrates. And it's done so exactly in the Apology. Because if I was a Greek citizen, an Athenian citizen, I think the thing that would have offended me most would have been Socrates directly comparing himself to Achilles. The Iliad, like the Havamal is not like the Bible, in many ways. The Iliad was like the Bible to the ancient Greeks in many ways. And so for Socrates to compare himself to Achilles is kind of a lot like hearing someone compare themselves to Jesus today. It's like, if you are a believer, you will probably be very offended and like, what the hell do you think you're talking about? But it mattered to Socrates. And curiously enough, he, through philosophy rather than through great deeds of martial prowess, through his Aristeia on the battlefield, was able to achieve a great deal of immortality through the word, which is why we're talking about him now. And philosophy has acquired that association in a strange way, and in a way that kind of hasn't been lost since then.
Well, I mean, I think there's something about the preservation of the written word as well, that it leads to, because actually my retweet thing, Kate retweeted the thing the other day, and you retweeted it as well. That the writing a book is the best way to still the best way to upload your consciousness.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. Basically they uploaded their consciousness into the system. The big system of human knowledge and exchange, and the written word. But they were able to achieve more mortality through that.
Right. Well, Plato did. Socrates is an interesting one because not only did he never write anything down,
right,
he was actually critical of writing. He very famously said that he was in response to hearing some story about Thoth bringing the gift of writing to some other kingdom far away. He said, you think that is a gift, but in fact it's a curse because it'll make everyone forgetful and unable to think. And so it's a weird moment of transition, kind of, where, I mean, Homer really was this, because Homer was perhaps the great first poet that got written down. But, culturally that takes time. The Gutenberg press didn't arrive and then everyone's reading books the next day.
Right.
But there's this point of inflection where Greek culture shifted from being an oral culture to a written culture. And Socrates was still, perhaps in his Homeric composition and performance, connection, still very much in that oral mindset. And immortalization was possible through stories, through oral traditions, but it required a lot more of a living tradition, whereas a book can sit dormant like some H.P. Lovecraft horror for hundreds of years and then reemerge out of the depths when it's rediscovered and create something like the Enlightenment.
I feel attacked. As an author, I feel attacked. No, I mean, absolutely. One thing, there's a conflict that I've noticed a little bit among orators and writers. To a certain extent, people who are better at orators, and because there's certain people who can just, I mean, and that was a skill in the ancient days. I mean, I always talk about the Germanic material, the skalds and whatever, and really rappers. Today, dudes who can literally speak in rhyme wittily at speed and on beat, like instantaneously. That is a magical skill like obviously some of these guys had. And there are a lot of guys who are just, public speaking. I mean, I always joke that, like, I still can't believe I went to a Jordan Peterson thing and that dude just sells out a thing and rolls up. And I'm like, I wonder what I'll talk about today. And I just, do it to a whole basketball stadium. I mean, that takes huge balls to me. But I guess if you're confident in it and you do it, whereas I feel like my best work is always would probably be the trickery kind. I guess where you have the time with it, and you can say something really eloquent and good in just the perfect way, but that doesn't come out of my mouth. I talk like a drunk sailor. But but when I'm writing, I'm like
technos, yes,
yeah, very very direct. But when I'm writing, I mean, I can come up with I'm like, this is amazing alliteration. Like wow, I can't do that in real life. Yeah.
It's fascinating to think about all the pros and cons of writing versus speech. Just generally, I heard one other writer in the Christian blogosphere who said you couldn't trust people who are gifted speakers. And he was talking about Jordan Peterson in particular, because they flow from one point to the next, and they carry you with them, and it's very easy to forget what they said 5 minutes prior.
Yeah.
And they can walk you through emotionally. Whereas if you write something down, someone who's reading it can read through, and if there's any discontinuity, any incoherence, it's much easier to go back and check and spot. And so he said he actually trusts good writing more than good speaking.
Well, I like that about him. That was a good point he made. Well, there is something mathematical about writing in the sense of here's a paragraph, here's a paragraph, here's a paragraph. This one better make sense with that one, or the whole thing doesn't work. And it has to flow. But whereas, I guess that is a good argument. If you're a speaker, you're a little bit more like a salesman, right? Because a salesman can tell a story and make you feel a certain way, but not necessarily. They don't actually have to say anything that makes sense.
And if there's any artistic case on the enjoyment of reading these Platonic dialogues, it's the way they manage to seem to merge both. Because what you have is phenomenal speaking, and sometimes phenomenal dialogue. Oftentimes it's just a blah 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 blah. Yeah. Why yes, blah 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 blah, and then a longer monologue is like, well, certainly, blah 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 blah. Longer monologue again is like, well, I guess that follows, and it is this kind of weird hypnotic walking the fake, interlocutor through this sequence that never happens in real life. But some of the back and forths are real, like Euthyphro. Like there's an actual exchange of ideas there. And what's startling about reading these Socratic dialogues or Platonic dialogues is the memory of Socrates from the beginning of the book to the end of the book feels almost superhuman. It is the feeling and the form of speaking, but with the benefit of that consistency of having been written down and checked and everything. So it's as a matter of style, the Platonic dialogues regarding Socrates' death and the other ones as well are a fascinating sort of artistic exploration of kind of both of those things as well.
Well, I mean, that's what you do as a biographer too. I mean, like there's people who are taken with a character and they flesh them out as a character, and like they give us a take on who that guy was, and you'll see several different biographies. They'll have different takes. Like I'm sure there are different takes on George Washington than the book that I read, but I really like that take. That guy had a very specific take. Ron Chernow had a very good, he had a very.
He's a very good biographer.
Yeah, he had a very good take on George Washington, but obviously there's some probably anyone's going to have they're not objective. Yeah, you're going to have your own. What you think of that character is going to come through into that. Your analysis of it. Like me writing if I was going to write the biography of that guy who's accusing his dad, I'm like, you got some daddy issues, you want some money, but that might not be true, but that's my take. That'd be my take. So it's just interesting. I mean, obviously Plato had his feelings about Socrates, and as he wrote that down, I mean, that's how he characterized this man. Probably not unbiased. No, I mean, why would it be? Who's right? Show me a man without bias. It's absolutely a thing. So I'm sure that he did have some of that as well. Yeah. But why don't we hit on the thing you wanted to bring up about the archetypes? It sort of dovetails in with the bias thing too, because there's the bias for Socrates, but then we mentioned Nietzsche briefly earlier. Mm-hmm. There are certainly arguments against Socrates, and Nietzsche very famously, probably the maybe even topping Aristophanes as a critic of Socrates. Mm-hmm. And he accused Socrates of essentially banishing Dionysus. He said that the peak, the golden age of Greek civilization came from the artistic fusion of the spirit of Apollo and Dionysus. Mm-hmm. And Socrates, as a
servant of Apollo of sorts, was so single-mindedly set on his mission of rationality and more important than rationality, rational justification for anything. Nietzsche at one point says, like, the Socratic principle is that which cannot be explained is not known. Whereas, like, you have all kinds of things. Animals know things without being able to explain them. Any kind of natural at an art or a sport or a skill won't be able to explain how they do it. But that doesn't mean they don't know.
That's the terrible thing about the modern. I'm all hesitant to use the word modern around you because we have this contention about it. But I would say really 20th century more than anything. But you could tie it back to Socrates, the quote that you just said. But this idea that anything that can't be measured by science yet, if there isn't the scientific,
then it's not true.
Then it's not true. Then they're throwing everything before the 20th century out with the bathwater, basically, because we can't explain it yet.
Well, and Nietzsche's criticism of Socrates dovetails directly thereafter into a criticism of science, which he thinks is basically systematized spiritual Socratism, which, I mean, I wrote about in that essay on Pater for people who want to read it, on the spiritual origins of science. It goes into that in detail.
That's a really good one, by the way. I just always remember the bee stings, but yes.
Yes. Well, thank you. Schmidt is such a hero. But like, he basically accuses Socrates of banishing Dionysus, who is this god of the music of the fields and of the flutes, and is this slightly terrifying, but also this vivacious life force. And it's this kind of unconstrained life force that is anathema to this idea of I have to understand everything. I have to conceptually capture and be able to articulate a thing in order for it to be true, in order for it to be real. You get a maybe a taste of extremity in the other direction when Plato was trying to define man as a featherless biped, and Diogenes of Sinope runs and is like, "Behold the man!" And he's got this plucked chicken that he's flailing around. And it's like that's maybe some Dionysian spirit there to balance out this extreme Apollonian desire for everything must be constrained and bound by words and so forth. But there's an interesting parallel within the context of solar idealism. We talk about these three archetypes: the father, the striker, and the lord of the earth. And Socrates is, of course, very much a father figure in a lot of different ways. He's like the father of Western philosophy, literally a father, and also was a soldier. And he, aside from fighting in the phalanx and speaking about it in the Apology, he also, fought with people verbally his whole life, basically. And was very annoying about it. And it seems like the thing he was lacking was all of the dimensions of the Lord of the Earth, which just visually and aesthetically ties in to this Dionysian satyr kind of character associated with life, fertility, business in some cases, but also maintaining relationships and friendships. Like Socrates' extreme disagreeableness was kind of anathema to that. And I guess to throw one more dichotomy into these archetypal comparisons, I wrote a little bit about the archetype of the hero that we see with Achilles against the archetype of the man. And I chose those words based on the opening lines, which are very thematically significant. The first word in the Odyssey is andra, man. Tell me, muse, of that man. Because Odysseus is an archetypal man. He is a lord of the earth. He does not speak a technos. He's very polutropon, this way and that way. He's and Achilles even accuses him of being tricky in that way. Very, very roughly. He's very mean about it. And you see that, interestingly, in, again, the Apology, where Socrates not only compares himself to Achilles and aspires for a similar kind of spirit there, but condemns Odysseus as basically an unrighteous man towards the end. And he's looking forward to the afterlife where he gets to ask questions of the heroes of the past. And he'll get to interrogate Odysseus about, why did you unjustly kill Ajax or whoever it was? And that rejection of Dionysus that Nietzsche identified seems to parallel with the rejection of the man more broadly as an archetype and of the Lord of the Earth. All of these more mundane earthly things. And perhaps that rejection, which ties into the rejection of money, he was poor, and of human relations and of wealth, maybe got him killed. And we might, who aspire to be better ourselves, perhaps we won't go down in history as famous philosophers, but perhaps we might have better lives if we don't reject that archetype. And perhaps our civilization will be better too, because Nietzsche basically accused him of ruining Greek civilization, and said, this was before his big breakup with Richard Wagner. He thought Germany was in a unique position to maybe bring back the union between the spirit of Apollo and Dionysus. You need both to make good art, to make good culture. And Socrates and the cultural dominance of Socrates kind of ruined that. And I think he was looking at the romanticism of that time and saying, maybe there's a seed of something. Maybe we need a little bit more Apollo, but like we can work with this into something truly, golden age, age of not classical era, but like age of Homer, Greek levels of cultural beauty and accomplishment. That might be a little grand for individuals, but perhaps the principle works the same way with individuals. And perhaps Plato, who is much more circumspect about Odysseus, gets closer to that balance and say, maybe we can have a little bit of all three. Maybe we can have our balanced chariot, with the the logos, the passions, and the appetites in harmony, rather than the other. I'm sorry, I'm going on so long. Socrates was famous. If Dionysus and the Lord of the Earth have anything to do with the appetites, Socrates was famous for being able to stand outside in the cold, completely unmoved, in wearing very little, and could go for long periods without eating, was basically completely unaffected by alcohol, was just this absolutely had completely conquered his desires and his appetites in this way.
I didn't realize that. It was, obviously in these stories, he's very, doesn't have any money. And is very whatever, but I didn't realize that level of asceticism was part of his whole shtick.
Very much.
Because that's, obviously, that definitely puts him firmly in the borderline autistic, and really in the puritanical camp of pure logic and reason and nothing else, and no.
Well, autistic
what is that thing about will make a dull boy? I don't know,
all work and no play.
Yeah. It's I feel like that seems like his descriptive of him.
Autism is a funny one, because Nietzsche's psychoanalytic diagnosis of Socrates was that whereas every other man creates by impulse, creates by naturally, but it takes effort and conscientiousness to be like, I think this is wrong, and they'll think something like, oh no, that's not quite right. He says with Socrates, that impulse is reversed. He has that daemon, that inner voice that tells him no. instinctively to bad arguments, to things he shouldn't say, to things other people say. But when he wants to create, he has to sit down and think through and very effortfully put together something. And the best he can put together, which we read about in Phaedo at the very end, is he makes some verse translations of Aesop's fables, which in Nietzsche's opinion are like the most ham-fisted moralizing tales ever. There's nothing artistic about that. So like if the beauty and accomplishment of the Greek culture came from that impulse to create, then Socrates' excessive Apollonian desire for clarity destroyed that. And it destroyed it in himself first.
Interesting.
So,
yeah, I mean, there's definitely something there, I think, in terms of, and it's interesting when it's applied to Socrates, but just generally speaking, that Dionysian element in man, I mean, that's what they, from the Homeric hymns about the Dionysus, if you forget me, you forget how to write a sweet song.
Yes,
is in there. And so I mean, and that's true. And I see that really, in the contemporary aspect, there's been a big problem with men generally, and especially men
being inhibited.
And I've kind of linked it to the idea of sex pollution, is the thing, like they can't do anything that women do. So if women like art, then they can't like it.
Right.
Like that's, which is kind of part of the problem, I think, in the way that I think I've mentioned recently that men aren't allowed to do theater in America, which is why we also have nobody who can act heroic roles.
Right.
We have nobody who does Shakespeare. So who you can hire? Like they don't do that in high school. And the only people
Henry Cavill does okay,
but he's English.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
In American, yeah, we import all of our heroes. Like all the men who can have the gravitas to play those roles are almost all, aside from, I mean, the best we have, and this is very telling because he's also generally regarded as being kind of off and weird, is I mean, there are other ones, but they're more like the young, fun heroes. They're not necessarily like the ones with gravitas.
Clint Eastwood, but he's kind of old.
Yeah, he's kind of old. I mean, that's a different era, and that's before I think that this was true. I think you could still do theater in Clint Eastwood's age.
Yeah.
What Ryan? What's his face? Who was
Ryan Gosling?
Yeah, Ryan Gosling is. We get Ryan Gosling.
Yeah. He's
instead of,
a little different in Drive than he is in Barbie.
Right. Ryan Gosling and Keanu Reeves is what we instead of like dudes who can be like, yes, sir. Because you have to be able to do Shakespeare to be able to do or some of these ancient things.
Arnold, Austrian.
Yeah.
Mel Gibson, Australian. Isn't Russell Crowe Australian too?
Very Australian.
Damn it.
Fighting around the world. But what we do have Sylvester Stallone is it's a thing. It definitely is a thing. We import most of our actors that play our heroes, but because I think we've lost touch with that male creativity, and you see that a lot.
And it's worth noting that Dionysus is also the god of theater, among other things. Yeah.
Yes, that is true, and you also see that in a big way, I think, because I think the Puritanism of American culture, which is very Protestant, and the Puritanism and that kind of Protestant evangelical aesthetic that populates a big portion of the country, especially the part in which conservatism lies and gets all of its money. They create nothing.
Yeah,
they can't create art.
I have to go back and read The Birth of Tragedy again now, because my recollection was that as harsh as his criticisms of Socrates are, a lot of it is vicarious for the influence Socrates had on a certain playwright, which is Euripides. Mm-hmm. And he said, in the same way that Socrates basically killed culture by turning Euripides into an anti-artist. And a theater, a playwright where everything had to be conscientious, where everything had to be, explicated very directly. Gone was show not tell. Now it's tell. And he said there was like a moment where Euripides flipped back and did a good play, and that was the Bacchae, which is about Dionysus.
Of course.
But in general, he said Socrates ruined culture by ruining the theater. So it is just interesting that you brought that up.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's in terms of, that kind of dry analytical stuff. Well, that was what I've kind of been saying, is that they can't produce anything that's not didactic. Like it has to be like, here's our ham-fisted point, in the way that actually the far left's art has become unwatchly boring. Yeah, in terms of, because
it used to be okay. It used to be
great. They made the best art.
Yeah,
but it was very Dionysian. You like in the age of the 1970s, the Rolling Stones, and like, that's a whole different era. And now you have like telling you who has to be included and has to, like, all the rules that you have to impose on it, and
it's
everything
become Apollonian.
Exactly. It's become Apollonian in this weird way. And so, like, what you really need is a rise of the Dionysian I hate left and right because they don't mean anything, but like that
human, that Lord of the Earth, that creative impulse that's uninhibited by the lines and boundaries of things, which can be kind of scary. And it's not, in some ways, it's not as masculine in some ways.
Well, that's why I actually like this economy. And I think that, remember I said that was going to be my essay for when we work on the Put There book. But there's a very masculine impulse to order everything. Obviously, I mean, I wrote a book that said something like that. Men do like order, and they want to order things. And I think good art really has to be ordered. It has to be.
Of course,
because otherwise it has no structure. I always say that it's so much easier to paint an 18 by 24 than it is to, like, if you gave somebody infinite space, that's impossible to deal with. 18 by 24, I can figure out. If you give someone an assignment, like, okay, I can figure that out. Just paint anything. That's much scarier. I think you need some kind of order imposed on art for it to exist, but there's also, you do need that kind of, that humanness, really. I don't think of it as feminine. Yeah. What?
There's a balance. Well, and that's the thing about Dionysus too, is he's not feminine either. He's sort of androgynous. He's this merging point between the two.
Yeah.
And
which is very Camille Paglia.
Yes.
He might be called a sexual persona.
But yeah, I have a hunch that Camille Paglia might have read Nietzsche at some point.
Possibly. That's like I said, that's where I learned about Apollonian Dionysius with sexual persona.
Right.
But just to, probably have to wrap it up, but it's an earthiness.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a realization. As we can be as scientific and like sterile about things as he's tried to be good, but really what they are, as we've talked about many times, is they become deniers of the body.
Yes.
Like, we're made of flesh and blood, and we have desires, and
just purely in the word and the idea when you exclude that Lord of the Earth.
Exactly. And you don't see the you're afraid of the body. That's why people look back at the Greek art to a certain extent. It's like the first people like, oh, they made beautiful bodies, and they're like, and it's what people want to see.
And one of the points you sort of joked about, but maybe not totally joking, a few weeks ago. You're like, how much of this is just Socrates being old and ugly?
It's like, ugly people hate beauty in a weird way. They're jealous of it in a strange way. It's like I do think. Who knows if that can if that has anything to do with this? You don't want to make that.
It makes a fun joke, if nothing else, but it's also something worth thinking about, and something that you pick up in Nietzsche's writing a lot on these sorts of things about how, where Socrates says, oh, if you get a bad wife, you're likely to become a philosopher. Nietzsche said, if you are unhealthy, if you have poor health, you are more likely to become a philosopher, to write away, to explain away these health problems. And that creates an unfortunate asymmetry in philosophy more broadly as well, where we get all kinds of interesting figures, not least of which being Nietzsche himself.
What's nice about Nietzsche in that perspective is that he's self-aware, because Nietzsche has shitty health. Like that's a self-awareness thing, and I like self-awareness from people. One of my favorite qualities in people generally is a self-awareness enough to know that you can still acknowledge what is good without having to be it.
Yes.
Which is rare in people, because everybody has to make everything about themselves. And if whatever I am is the best, or to say that out loud to make themselves and everyone else believe it. And instead of just trying to imagine what is actually good, I think that takes a special kind of, and
it's a good thing to remember. It doesn't apply in every case. Like Nietzsche, I think, is a good exception. But I was listening to a gentleman we both like very much, Sam Harris, interviewing David Benatar, who is the South African philosopher that advocates antinatalism.
Okay.
Now, if you picture in your head, what would a philosopher, an academic philosopher who advocates antinatalism look like?
He's ugly.
Just put that picture in your head. And then Google search him. He looks exactly like you imagined he would look. Weird. And so like, and that's will be dismissed as ad hominem by people who go into that. But like the pattern is still hard to overlook, and it's worth remembering in terms of you begin with artistic values. Now, I think that was really Nietzsche's great breakthrough and his great criticism of Socrates. It's like that there is an unstated aesthetic value that Socrates pretends not to have, which is to just contemplate. His end goal is just the contemplation of things forever.
Yes.
And perhaps there's more to life than that. Perhaps there are things of the earth that are worth doing. And not as Aristophanes characterized, just having your head in the clouds.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
You could talk about Socrates for a lifetime, but
Socrates and Nietzsche, we could just go back and forth for a while. And Apollo and Dionysus, but I think we should wrap it up there. But I think this has been a really interesting conversation, and I think representative, I think, of some of the cool things that we do in the Order of Fire, and some of the conversations that we try to have with the guys. I've when people are interested and willing to have them, we can get into some good stuff, because I think the idea of not reinventing, because I hate reinventing, because that's a weird propaganda always, but the idea of intentionally figuring out what we actually believe, instead of trying to like inherit or write it down from somebody else, and actually like doing the work. I think is very interesting, exciting to be in a place where you can do that with some kind of honesty and intention. Whereas I think that's kind of what makes us unique. Like, well, what do we actually believe? Let's talk about justice and see what we actually think justice is. Rather than like, well, clearly it's so and so because my this place people or that people believe it. Like, well, what? Let's hash it out.
Right.
So I think that's a great place to be. So anyway, man, thanks for coming on and having this discussion again. It's been a good one. So see you guys later. Stay solar.
Stay solar.
Pater is the cultural arm of the Order of Fire. For more, visit PH2T3R.com.